Welcome to episode 2 of CRE Unscripted with Jared and Rob. I'm Rob Ondak. This is my partner, Jared Oakes, and you may recall from episode number 1, we are partners in the commercial real estate group at Benish. Last week, our subject matter was focused on the retail industry and sector. Today, we're going to have a broader subject matter, and we're going to talk to you a little bit about the impact that COVID-19 is having on purchase agreements. I think just generally from a market perspective, while COVID-19 has certainly impacted our deals and slowed down our deals, I'm pleased to report we have found ways to get deals done even in this climate. And I think it's a testament to both buyers and sellers working together, the service providers that are working with them, the title companies providing really good service to get deals closed, and then innovating and finding ways to get deals done. Some of the things that we worked on in transactions over the last couple of weeks are when those delays pop up, finding ways to deal with the delays. The biggest issue that I've seen from a buyer's perspective has been potential loss of equity sources, loss of financing, or maybe interruption of financing. And we've worked with our clients to find alternative sources, alternative investors. In one instance, we even made an arrangement for seller financing and was able to get the deal closed. So we're finding creative ways to help buyers and sellers get their deals done and close their deals. So Jared, specifically, when we're talking about purchase agreements, what are some of the items that you're seeing that are now involving themselves in purchase agreements as a result of the COVID-19 impact on deals?
Yeah, so there's several things, but I would say the two things that impact buyers and sellers the most are timing issues and then closing issues. So from a timing perspective, as you know, purchase agreements generally don't have, as other contracts do, any sort of delay mechanism as it relates to due diligence or closing for force majeure type events or things that would cause a shutdown. It's typically very hard dates. You have, say, 30 days diligence, 30 days to close, or something like that, or you might have some extension, right? But typically they're not subject to extension for things that are out of the ordinary course. This has changed that, right? And so the deals have changed both to buyers are looking for just longer diligence periods generally to deal with the fact that we have some delays is what's going on right now. And then there's specifically been negotiated into purchase agreements a concept of a force majeure type provision where you toll due diligence or maybe toll closing if there is a COVID related event. And so where it comes down and where the negotiation happens is that the buyers are looking for flexibility, and they don't have a crystal ball, so they don't know exactly when the COVID event is going to end, and there are different things that cause a slowdown in the COVID type thing. So buyers are looking for flexibility, sellers are looking for certainty, right? And so sellers want as tightly drafted as possible the COVID related provisions, and buyers want as loosely drafted as possible. And so what you're seeing is thinking about the purchase agreement and what happens in a deal, the things that can cause that delays impact are survey work, environmental work, physical inspections, and then to the extent the buyer's representatives need to go to the site to either do interviews, to just take over the site, those things are all really impacted currently by the COVID shutdowns.
Jared, let's take a step back. Ordinarily in purchase agreements, unlike other contracts, you don't have this delay function. The force majeure delay, specifically with respect to due diligence, is not a concept you will typically see in a purchase agreement. So can you speak a little bit about inconvenience versus impossibility and how that impacts your drafting?
Right. So in order to do that, that's a very good point. In order to do that, you need to think about what is it that's causing the COVID delay. So in most states right now, almost all states, but a handful there's an actual shelter in place or stay at home order where the governor of that state has issued a mandate that certain things can't happen. And that has impact. There are some exceptions for that, but it has significantly impacted. In most places, it's stopped the ability to do the types of things you need to do to complete your physical inspections, your physical work of due diligence. And so in addition to the government mandates early on in this process, and we're going to see it on the way out, is there were other things. So it might have been, okay, there could be a governor mandate that you can't do something, but there's also sort of best practices or recommendations by whether it's the CDC or the NIH or different quasi-governmental entities about what you should do, who should be going to work, things like that. And then finally, I would say there's sort of private reasons for why you may not be able to do something, right? So it's harder to travel, right? There's fewer flights, and there are going to be fewer flights just because the demand isn't there. And so buyers may look to say like, okay, well, I'm impacted by that, and that should impact the timing of my due diligence. And sellers would say, that's an inconvenience. It may be harder to get there, but if you're able to do things, if you're able to get that work completed, then the COVID event, as we define it in the purchase agreement, should be over, right? And your diligence period should continue to run at that point.
Yeah. So I think the key takeaway from this is you're going to deal with the issue. Buyers and sellers are going to have to account for the real delays that are occurring, but there needs to be tight drafting. You need to be very specific as to the delay and how it is impacting your deal. And then particularly from a seller's perspective, you're going to want accountability. So you're going to want to build in provisions into the PSA that hold the buyer accountable so that you have a real timeline and that timeline doesn't carry on in perpetuity. Okay, but now Jared, we're getting into, here in Ohio, the governor just announced yesterday that we are going to start having this staged reopening of the economy as early as May 1st. So how does that staged reopening, how does that impact the issues that you're discussing here in terms of the delay?
Yeah, there's a couple things. One is you're starting to see the Midwest states are banding together, the Western states are banding together, the Northeastern states, and they're trying to have some sort of coordinated reopening, but it's very fact specific. Our practice is national. We're working on purchase agreements in most states, right? And so we need to understand in those states say phase one happens of the reopening of the economy. What does that mean? What industries are allowed to resume work? And so sellers, if they're looking to cause the COVID event to end under their purchase agreement, need to be very careful and pay attention to say, okay, if these things can happen and you're allowed to do the work now, the seller should be sending a notice saying, we believe the COVID event is over. And buyers on the flip side want to be wary and say, well, maybe that, but I can't do this, right? So that there's going to be some discussion around
Jared, I think that's a real key issue, particularly from a buyer's perspective. If you were delayed, let's say 14, 15 days as a result of the government mandated shutdown, when you start to reopen, when businesses start to reopen, it may not be a day-for-day delay. You may need to get a survey completed, but your survey is now backed up on 4 other projects. So instead of taking another week or 2 to get the survey done, it's going to take your surveyor maybe another month or longer to get to that. So from a buyer's perspective, you want to not only account for the fact that you've been delayed, but the impact of the delay on your diligence.
That is a good point. There is going to be a backlog of work that needs to happen when we reopen. I think that sellers, on the other hand, will resist that. They'll say there's reasons why we build in the length of the diligence periods we do. They'll probably want to negotiate. If they think that's going to be taken into account, they may want to negotiate just longer diligence periods generally, rather than giving some more than a day-for-day delay. But it's a very important point.
Okay, so Jared, we get through all these issues and the parties are able to navigate it. They're ready to close. What are some of the other issues that now, as a result of COVID, are part of the environment and part of the closing process?
Yeah, so I just want to point out one really important one, and that is that this is very unique in the situation where you have recorders' offices. Generally, recorders' offices have been able to stay open to some degree to allow recording. Sometimes that's electronic recording. The challenge is on the day of closing, are the title companies able to do their final search to make sure there's nothing has shown up on title since the last time they updated their search. And in that instance, the title companies were struggling with it, but they've all come around. Most of them, I think all of them, the major ones, have agreed they will issue title insurance on closing, even without being able to do that final search, as long as the buyer or the seller will give a fairly strong, not fairly, very strong gap indemnity, which is not your typical gap indemnity. And that's, for the most part, it's non-negotiable, right? The title company is saying, we're taking this underwriting risk, but we're passing that on to the gap to the buyer, to the seller.
Jared, anytime I hear non-negotiable, I get nervous, right? Because what's in that document, can you tell our viewers maybe one or two things they should really be looking at in these non-negotiable documents?
Yes, I would say there's two things that we really try to get. One is that the title company has an affirmative obligation as soon as the recording office is open to do their final search. And if nothing shows up in the intervening period between when they issued the policy, the date of the issuance of the policy, and the time they did that new search, then the gap indemnity agreement terminates, right? We've been able to get that with the major title companies. And the other one is, and this is more of just, I don't think it's inconsistent with the spirit of what's happening, but the gap indemnity forms that have been provided by the title companies are generic in the sense they cover really any kind of encumbrance that happens after the closing. And so we try to carve out from that encumbrances that are caused by the buyer or any party claiming or buyer through the buyer. So those are two important things. If you can get that, then those are important changes to add to the gap indemnity. Even if the company says they're non-negotiable, we're able to get that.
And lastly, Jared, are there any sort of general tips, best practices that you can provide for our viewers?
Yeah, so there's been a couple things that I think are important coming out of COVID, or will be important as you're negotiating purchase agreements during the situation. One is from the seller perspective, we've seen a desire to increase the amount of the earnest money deposit, and that's really to keep buyers honest because of the limited remedies in the event of a buyer to fall under a purchase agreement. The sellers want to have enough of an earnest money deposit so that the buyers don't just, make the decision. They want to give a negative incentive for them to not want to terminate the agreement.
And I've seen from a seller's perspective an increased push to have that earnest money after a period of time actually released to the seller to create even more incentive to get to closing. We're going to give you more time. We're going to give you a delay, but you need to put some more money up, and it needs to be in my hands.
That's right. That's important. If you can get that, that's great. Other thing is, increasing flexibility as it relates to notices, right? So it's a little hard to get. FedEx and UPS are still operating. It's hard to do that because nobody's in the offices. So allowing for email notices and allowing for your attorneys to send the notices as opposed to needing to be a hard copy notice coming out is very important.
That last issue I think is really important. In many purchase agreements that we receive, that is not always in there. And oftentimes on the end of the diligence period, the client is traveling someplace, they're not able to send the notice out, and they usually look to their attorney to send the notice out. So as a drafting tip, highly recommend that you include your attorneys as being an authorized representative for either the buyer or the seller so that they can send the notice on behalf of the buyer or seller.
Right, and that should be completely non-controversial. It benefits both parties, so both people should be in favor of it.
Thank you, Jared, and thank you again for tuning in to CRE Unscripted with Jared and Rob. I hope you all have a great weekend and stay healthy. Thanks
everyone.